study on protecting Canadian residents from extreme weather events.
Viva Canada, Mrs. Susan Penwarden, who is virtual, Manager Director of Personal Lines, Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, Paul Kovacs, Founder and Executive Director, and Madame Sophie Guilbeault, Directrice des Partenariats. From Intact,
she's Director of Partnerships.
Mr. Blair Feltmat, Head Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Chacun des témoins dispose de 5 minutes pour...
Each witness has 5 minutes to deliver the opening statements.
Thank you, Chair and committee members, for inviting me today. I'm Susan Penwarden, Managing Director of Personal Insurance for Viva Canada, a national property and casualty insurer serving 2.5 million customers across auto, personal property, and commercial insurance. I'm also the outgoing chair of the Insurance Bureau of Canada's Natural Catastrophe Committee and the co-chair of the Resilient Homes Task Force at the ICLR. All to say, I see firsthand both the human and economic impact of extreme weather events on Canadians from coast to coast. As I'm sure your study will demonstrate, we must act now to protect Canadians and their assets from this ever-increasing risk. For our part, Canadian insurers continue to manage escalating claims volumes while funding community-level projects that support resilience. We share your commitment to protecting Canadians, but the scale of this challenge means we cannot do it alone. We must adopt a whole-of-society approach to solving this challenge. So what can the federal government do to support a resilient future for our nation? Number one, a shift in mindset. We must move away from reactive disaster recovery and toward proactive investment in risk reduction and resilience. Why? Because simply put, it makes economic sense. Last year, insured losses from severe weather ballooned to $9.2 billion, a shocking sum, and yet only a portion of the total economic impact. As our ICLR colleagues will highlight, we estimate that insured losses account for less than half of total economic cost of disasters. In contrast, investing in adaptation and resilience creates wide-reaching benefits for Canadians and the broader economy, from the mitigation of direct losses to the ability of local economies to recover quickly. Through investments in research centers like ICLR, our industry knows how homes can be built to withstand these threats. We've invested in putting that knowledge to the test right now with 2 pilots in southern Alberta in partnership with both the ICLR and Habitat for Humanity. With this knowledge, Canada could become a global leader in adaptation, but we need the federal government's help to scale what works. This means updating the National Building Code and ensuring adaptation is at the core of the new Build Canada Homes agency framework. It also means supporting the manufacture of resilient building materials to improve their supply, making necessary upgrades cheaper for Canadians while also generating economy-wide benefits. At a municipal level, it's equally urgent for all levels of government to work together to ensure critical infrastructure is upgraded to meet the demands of future weather conditions. This leads me to point number 2. We need to close the adaptation funding gap through better capital allocation. The $2 billion Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund was massively oversubscribed. For perspective, it's estimated that Toronto alone needs $26 billion in infrastructure improvements to withstand severe weather. We need to give adaptation the urgency it deserves. 3, we need to ensure that all Canadians have adequate protection against flooding, which is Canada's greatest climate-related risk. Today, there are more than 1.5 million homes, or 10% of the current housing stock, currently built in areas of high-risk flooding. These properties, in effect, are becoming uninsurable. This is why we must continue to work on a national flood insurance program that is complementary to the private industry and will provide protection for those high-risk homes. However, this has to be a sustainable solution over the long term. The program must also incorporate elements of adaptation to reduce risks over time, while also discouraging local governments from steering future development towards these high-risk areas. And finally, 4, our industry, alongside coalitions like Climate Proof Canada, are urging the federal government to create a national emergency management agency to improve coordination for disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. We were glad to see the federal government's recent launch of a new weather alert system. This is an important step towards helping Canadians to protect themselves. However, Canada remains the only G7 country without a dedicated national emergency management agency, which would greatly enhance national coordination, strengthen resilience, and reduce the financial toll of natural catastrophes. To close my remarks, I must emphasize again that severe weather impacts people directly, their communities, and also our economy. The scale of the threat in the future depends on what we do today. If we act now, with making meaningful investment in resilience as a national priority, scaling adoption of evidence-based solutions, and better coordinating national disaster recovery and preparedness response, then we not only protect Canadians today, we also shift the economic trajectory of our nation and transform risk into an opportunity. With your support, we are ready to work with you to make adaptation part of Canada's economic strength. I thank you.
Ben Warden, and the floor is yours, Mr. Kovacs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Paul Kovacs. I'm the founder and executive director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Sophie's going to lead for us, and then I'll follow with some advice.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Sophie Guilbeault, je suis directrice.
Good morning. My name is Sifu Gibble, and I'm Director of the Partnerships with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction Institute, and I co-direct the Canadian Centre of Recovery and Resilience.
To build disaster-resilient communities, and we look forward to share our advice with you today. ICLR recently published a database tracking the history of societal, insured and uninsured losses from extreme weather damage. In 1994, Canada experienced $330 million in losses. Last year, we experienced $13 billion in damage, which includes $7 billion paid by insurance companies. Damage increased by 9.4% a year over several decades, which I'm sure you can agree is a trend that is very much unsustainable. The good news is that most of these $13 billion in losses last year are preventable. We know what to do. We know which locations in Canada are at high risk, and we know what are the 3 or 4 essential actions that can be taken to reduce the risk of severe damage to homes for different hazards. Often, these 3 or 4 actions can be accomplished under $15,000 per home. And we know that each dollar invested in resilience likely result to 5, 10, or more in terms of future avoided losses. If you can move to the next slide, I want to give some examples of how we know how to protect homes at risk. So this is from the floodings that happened in Montreal and Toronto last year. Insurance company paid $3.5 billion to 100,000 homeowners that had to clean up their basement from polluted water. And we know that on top of the uninsured claims, there was likely over $1 billion in damage to homes without insurance. Less than 10% of homes take preventative actions like putting in a backwater valve or a sump pump or having a landscaping that slopes the water away from their homes. Those are all measures that can be easily implemented and significantly reduce these costs. The other slide, if we can move to the next one, is from British Columbia. You can see here a house that was protected from wildfire by implementing things like a Class A fire-resistant roof, fire-resilient cladding, as well as a 1.5-meter non-combustible zone around the property, which stood up to the fire as opposed to the neighbor home who was completely destroyed. We've seen these cases in many communities in Canada when we did forensic investigations in Jasper, Kelowna, and all these places. And finally, the following slide is from Calgary last summer. If you can see at the top left picture, we have a roof that was previously rehabilitated with impact-resistant shingles following a hailstorm, and the other half was not. And you can see significant differences in damage. Similarly, if you look at the siding of the 2 homes next to each other, we see severe losses from wind-driven hail, with the one house on the right having vinyl siding that got severely impacted, and the one having impact-resistant siding on the left. So there are some good news in what we're sharing. We know how to reduce damage, but we must take actions like these to reduce these unsustainable trends.
Thank you, Sophie. We're rushing a little bit, trying to respect your time. I'm going to close with 3 recommendations. First, the Government of Canada should establish national building codes by 2030 to protect Canadian homes from flooding, wildfire, hail, and severe wind. Again, we know what to do. We just need to codify it, put it into the codes. Second of our 3 recommendations, Public Safety Canada should partner with the provincial and territory governments, with the insurance industry, and the focus should be, after a loss, we always build back better with resilience. After you experience a loss to your home or your community, the expectation always should be to build back better. The federal government's taken an important first step earlier this year with the modification of the disaster financial assistance arrangement. The need now is to coordinate the federal opportunity with provincial follow-through and collaborate with the insurance industry. And the third and final recommendation that we have today, as Susan started with, and we strongly agree, we need a coordinated approach to proactively encourage homeowners to implement the advice and changes that are needed. At the moment, the municipal governments and insurance companies have been bringing in a number of incentives in different communities in different ways. We do not yet have a national collaboration where the federal government, the provincial governments work with the others who benefit when a home is prepared, when a community is prepared. There are big savings that can be made. We think $1 can save 5 to 10. And at the moment, you've got municipal governments stepping up to some extent. You've got insurance companies stepping up. We're looking for the federal and provincial governments to have this collaboration, this overall pre-event. Let's get homes ready. Let's do all these things that our science shows can be done. So to conclude, thank you for the opportunity. We want to share with you that there is a crisis going on in the United States where they have failed to deal with the same issue that's confronting us. In my opinion, we are not in crisis, but we're going the wrong way very fast. The losses are moving up, and we know what to do about it. The fact that the Americans didn't do it, it's not a good excuse. We need to get on doing the right things. We need to proactively invest in risk reduction. We need to take advantage after a loss. We need to put in building codes so we do this before any risk comes at all. We think this does not need to become a crisis, but unfortunately we're going the wrong way fast. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Guilbeault. Thank you, Mr. Kovacs. And the floor is yours for 5 minutes, Mr. Feltmate.
Thank you very much. And my name is Dr. Blair Feltmate, and I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you. I'm head of the NTAC Center on Climate Adaptation, which is housed within the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo. I'm pleased to discuss the challenging topic of protecting Canadian residents from extreme weather events. More specifically, I'll zero in on how Canadians can protect themselves from residential basement flooding, which is the #1 cost of climate change in Canada, basements flooding, and I'll then turn to residential wildfire protection. As you will see, there is much that the federal government can do that is currently not being done to help homeowners help themselves to limit their exposure to the growing financial burden of flooding and wildfire. But before turning to these actions, let me just paint the picture of the formidability of the challenge we're facing in terms of insurance costs impacting Canada's housing market. I've shared a graph with you that you see on the screen that profiles insured losses for Canada from 1983 to the present. What matters most on this figure is the shape of the curve. It's bending upwards sharply, which means the costs of flooding and wildfires are getting worse faster. This is not where Canada wants to be. To go a bit further, as a result of growing extreme weather, 10% of Canada's housing stock, that's 1.5 million homes, is no longer insurable for flood risk. That's 1 in 10 homeowners who are unable to insure their biggest financial investment and their retirement plan, their home. No insurance is a problem for many, given the average cost of a flooded basement in this country right now is $54,000. In Quebec, in communities where flood risk exceeds 5% in a given year, Desjardins has stopped renewing mortgages. This trend will continue across Canada if we don't get ahead of the curve on adaptation. Over the past 12 years in Canada, for homes and communities impacted by catastrophic flooding, the resale value of homes dropped by 8%, which has changed the loan-to-value ratio on mortgages. Our group, the NTAC Center, will soon release a new report documenting that for homeowners living in flood-impacted neighborhoods, we see spikes in the costs of medications to cope with mental stress, psychosocial stress, counseling services, and lost time for work. These are your constituents who are suffering. Turning to some wildfire facts, State Farm and Allstate have stopped writing home fire insurance in California and Arizona. Without fire insurance, you cannot secure a mortgage, which renders a home a stranded asset. In Canada, we need to understand, as Paul referenced, that we are not immune to a California-style situation. Now that we've covered the bad news, the depressing stuff, let's turn to some good news, starting with the return on investment associated with preparing homes for flooding and wildfire. Notably, $1 invested in adaptation produces in avoided losses per decades about $3 to $8. So what does adaptation look like for Canadian homeowners? This leads us to the infographics I've shared with you, starting with 3 steps to cost-effective home flood protection. In the interest of time, I'll leave similar infographics that focus on the community flood and wildfire protection for another day. The information presented on the infographic is based on input from the Standards Council of Canada, Canadian Red Cross, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and scores of subject matter experts. Along the top row of the infographic, you see steps that a homeowner can take to protect their home for $0 to lower their flood exposure. Actions can be as simple as checking that a sub pump works by adding water to a sump well and seeing if the pump turns on and pumps water outside. Most people find out that their sub pump doesn't work when they walk into 3 feet of sewer water in their basement. For a little bit more effort, a battery backup supply can be connected to a sub pump to keep it running in the event of an electricity outage that is very common during major precipitation events. Turning to wildfire risks, 3 steps to a cost-effective fire-smart home, the material I shared with you. You see that many simple actions can be taken to limit exposure to wildfire, such as removing shrubs from within a few meters of a house and replacing them with non-burnable material. These infographics, the ones I've shared with you, motivate homeowners to act, and this is the key point. Upon receiving infographics, within 6 months, 70% of homeowners take at least 2 actions to protect their home that they otherwise would not take. Currently, the infographics on flood and wildfire risk are being shared with customers of major Canadian banks, RBC and BMO, credit unions such as Meridian Credit Union, and property and casualty insurer customers and clients. Through these distribution channels, currently the infographics are being shared with about 3.5 million Canadian homeowners twice per year. The federal government could help Canadian homeowners to protect their homes by distributing flood and wildfire infographics on Government of Canada websites, Environment Climate Change Canada, Public Safety Canada, Housing and Infrastructure. I'll finish my last sentence. Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, published in 2023, stipulated that by 2025, 50% of Canadians have taken concrete actions to better prepare for and respond to climate change risk facing their households. The infographics I've shared offer a proven means to make this to meet this NSA, this National Adaptation Strategy target. Thank you,
Dr. Feltmate. And now we will start with the Conservative Party. For 6 minutes, Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, and thank you for having me at committee today. I'm not a usual member. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'll start with Ms. Penwarden. We're talking about creating financial or incentives for people to protect their own properties. I noticed that there was no recommendation to provide a tax credit for, mitigating fire or flood risk in homes. Is that something that you think would be useful in encouraging Canadians in high-risk areas to protect their homes?
I think anything we can do to help Canadians pay attention to this would be good. There are a number of actions and incentives provided, for example, at the municipal level at the moment, provided by the government. People can just access them freely. Our main challenge, if I'm honest, is actually making everyone aware of those things and then encouraging them to actually act. So there's an education and then action component that if they work together, I think we would see a bigger take-up. And so there's definitely options around that.
Kelowna this summer on a wildfire tour, and they had just done a Fire Smart where they were telling people to remove their juniper bushes next to their properties. And yet the local school was doing a fundraiser a week later selling people juniper bushes so they could plant them right next to their properties. So Your thoughts on a tax credit for home renovations for putting sprinkler systems or flood mitigation systems? Any thoughts, Mr. Kovacs? Ms. Guilbeault?
On side, as Susan was touching on, any incentives are a good thing, anything that brings us awareness. We've been promoting more coordination, so we'd like to see the federal governments coordinating with the provinces and the municipal governments and the insurance industry in a unified approach, but tax incentives can be a very helpful part of that.
I know there's been, over the past number of years, at least 5 years that I've been watching it, there's been a lot of talk about creating a national flood insurance policy. I mean, that doesn't cover all, but as you said, Dr. Feltmate, basement flooding is the largest insurable loss in Canada currently. Do you know where we're at on national flood insurance policy in this country?
Right now, it remains a work in progress. There's a group called Climate Proof Canada that is an assemblage of insurers and NGOs and academics that are looking at what would be the steps to be engaged to launch this program. But right now, I think it's sort of in a sort of sitting level status. It's not moving forward or backwards at the moment, I don't think.
Okay, Mr. Kovacs, or
I'd only add that there's maybe 10% of homeowners that can't get flood insurance right now. To make a decision to put a program in place is something we need right now.
So the program wouldn't be for the 90% that donate, it would be for the 10% of people that can't get insurance coverage.
Most of us live in places where the risk of river flooding is not serious, 90% or so, and flood insurance is offered in the private sector. It's been taken up quite a bit. It's fairly affordable. The problem is those with high or extreme risk, and that's where coverage is, where most of the flooding happens and where most of the risk is. And to move forward to make a decision, having a program would be very helpful.
Now, I've seen some, different models. The Americans have a model through FEMA. I think the UK has just launched a model. What are some recommendations you could make on things to avoid if you were crafting a policy like that, based on,
I don't want to sound flippant, but usually what the Americans do is not working.
Okay. Yeah, I see it's about a $20 billion shortfall in their program through FEMA. I see that the UK had a policy where they would only provide subsidies for the insurance premiums for 25 years. Can you tell us why that is? Do you know why that is?
So, frankly, coming up with a program so that all Canadians are protected against flood and other hazards, so that you have insurance if you experience a loss, you can recover, there's money available, is really important. That's really critical to have. Better than having a program where money is paid after loss is to not have a loss. So the commitment in the UK was to try over 25 years for a national commitment to avoid any risk of loss, put in flood defense, put in all kinds of protection. Some of us are a little skeptical whether that'll get completed in 25 years, whether there's enough funding, but the concept was it would take some time. 25 years was the time chosen politically, 25 years to not need flood insurance because you'd have protection.
Interesting. So the government kind of set itself a deadline of 25 years to protect all the communities that were at risk of flood so that there wouldn't be a need for the flood insurance program. Interesting. One reason I heard is that they wanted to give people 25 years to financially plan for a future where they wouldn't have subsidized flood insurance so that they could possibly sell their property and move to a safer area, or that they could, have 25 years to invest in mitigations. Is that another reason why to have it?
Fully agree. Absolutely correct. To take the risk down to an acceptable level, that in the next 25 years we could have enough flood protection that most homes would not experience extraordinary flood risk would be a good thing. But there's still risk. I mean, you can have these very, very extreme events.
Now, can you tell us I've got 1 minute, is the DFAA program successful? And if it's not, how is it failing?
So the DFA is very proactive in the sense that it says fairly clearly, we will not pay again if you choose to rebuild in a high-risk area without the appropriate mitigation measure. And I think this is a very strong step in the right direction in that it forces, it supports that understanding of risk and that risk mapping and that mitigation planning to get to a place where we...
The changes made this year in DFA were outstanding.
What were those changes?
To focus on risk reduction, to focus on a future where we are truly trying to have more focus on reducing risk in addition to paying for losses.
Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Monsieur Saint-Pierre, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Thank you. So over the
Mr. Saint-Pierre, you have 5 minutes.
Canada went from around 38 catastrophic events from 1985 to 1994 to then doubling those catastrophic events to about 78 between 2005 and 2014. Given the increased rise of CO2 and climate pollution, we've now doubled those catastrophic events in Canada in the last decade to about 133, and 44 of those were water-related. These are events that Canadians are faced with every day, and the most vulnerable people in our society have to bear the cost. I've actually seen these impacts myself in my own riding. This past summer in the riding of Anjou, basements were flooded, so sort of a flash flood. I think Mr. Feltman mentioned $54,000 was the average cost of a flooded basement. And given the frequency of these flooding events, a lot of homeowners are unable to insure their basements. So it sort of adds to the housing crisis that some of my residents are feeling in Anjou. We're seeing that the annual cost of flooding is projected to hit $1.8 billion next year. So maybe my question to Mrs. Penn-Warden, would you agree that with the rise of climate change, Canadians are paying a greater price for adapting to catastrophic events?
Well, I think you've laid out the statistics yourself, which says certainly what we see with more and more extreme weather and the more frequent extreme events, as you've described, it is costing the economy and individual constituents and consumers and Canadians more each year in terms of both the insured cost, but also the personal cost, because it takes time to recover, because it takes time to rebuild, and whether they can afford insurance or not will obviously affect, the impacts. But it certainly is an escalating issue, and you can see it in some of the graphs that my colleagues have presented to you today.
Sure, like Aviva, pass on those costs to one of your clients, and would you anticipate costs to be increased in the future in terms of?
Well, I think what we can say is that Canadians are subject to many impacts of climate and extreme weather across a number of different vectors, including insurance. So anything that we can do now, as I've said in my call to action, to start to mitigate some of those impacts by taking some of the actions we've discussed will help to change the impacts in the future. So we have an opportunity, and I welcome the discussion we're having today in order to change that trajectory and change that curve.
Great. Mr. Feltmate, the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation recently produced a report called Managing Risks, Climate Resilient Shorelines for Canada. The report talks about Canadian shorelines facing risks to climate change. My colleague from Halifax is probably seeing some of those impacts herself. Can you provide a copy of this report to this committee and in less than a minute explain why nature-based or engineered solutions are required to protect our shorelines?
Yeah, so can we share the copy? The answer is yes. And basically what historically in reference to protecting shorelines, actions have turned to immediately to built infrastructure like a large cement revetments that would hold back the water, which is good. But sometimes that can end up just passing the problem further down to shore, that you solve a problem in one area, but it can cause a change in the flow dynamics along the shoreline such that solving your problem can exacerbate somebody else's. But we found that if we look at using natural infrastructure, grasses, shrubs, sedges along shoreline areas working in combination with built infrastructure, that the two working in hand in glove take risk out of the system that can't be realized just using one or the other on its own. And engineers historically have leaned towards like the big mega infrastructure projects, but sometimes we found now that the natural infrastructure working in hand in glove with built infrastructure mitigates shoreline flood risk. And by the way, the big challenge is sea level right now is rising at 6 millimeters per year, which is a lot. That's going to change the shorelines around the world, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences.
Great, thanks for that. And a few years ago, you and your colleague, I believe Catherine Bakos, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, produced a report called Change in Extreme Weather Risk from Institutional Investing. I'm curious if you could provide a copy of that report to the ENVI committee. And the report speaks to practical means to factoring in climate change and extreme weather risks into institutional investing. what you call climate risk matrices, or CRM. We know that the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, and the IISB have frequently called out for the need for better adapting climate risks to institutional and investment decisions. What should investors incorporate, or how and why should investors incorporate physical climate risk into portfolio management? So thinking about commercial real estate portfolios, the banking or wind and electricity generation.
Right now, institutional investors, when they think about climate change, the pension funds, they mostly focus almost exclusively on transition risk, the cost of on carbon and what it means to the companies they invest in. And that's fine to do. But what they've virtually completely and totally ignored are the impacts of flood, fire, hail, wind, snow load, physical climate risk impacting the operations of the companies they invest in. So now that's being brought to their attention that they have to consider both mitigation and adaptation simultaneously.
Monsieur Bonnet, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Bonnet, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mrs. Penwarden, you spoke about the federal government's adaptation strategy of $2 billion compared to Toronto, where the needs are $26 billion. In light of the fact that the adaptation needs would be how much? How would you assess that for the rest of Canada?
I don't have exact figures, but if Toronto needs $26 billion, I think you can start to imagine the impacts and the adaptation gap that we have in terms of investing. What I will say is in the current investment portfolio objectives, there is a $6 billion fund that has been put aside in the government's current budgets to actually engage and invest in projects in communities that can make a difference in terms of resilience and adaptation. It's not sufficient, but I would say at least it's a step in the right direction. What we would do is welcome, obviously, more investment at a higher level across the country to support adaptation.
You've mentioned the $6 billion. Are you referring to the fund for the communities? But I think it's far beyond adaptation. It is for public transit, for housing, etc., I take it.
Yes, there's a Build Community Strong Fund, which is $51 billion over 10 years, but there is a $6 billion tranche of that, which is to support regionally significant projects, including climate adaptation. So there is a subset within that overall plan at the moment. Not to say that that is everything that we need, but it is a good step in the right direction.
D'accord. Donc vous dites c'est
So you're saying that it's $6 billion over how many years? Is it specifically for adaptation? And how much do you believe should be set aside for adaptation? Could you give us a figure for the rest of Canada and the provinces, or what kind of numbers we have to meet the need?
I'm not an expert in calculating the adaptation cost needed for the entire country, so I would not be the right person to answer that question. All I can do is point to what we have and the $6 billion that's being earmarked at the moment and say this is good progress, but we would obviously welcome more investment by the federal government in adaptation to accelerate our response to what we see.
Est-ce que, de la part de nos autres témoins ici, est-ce que...
As to the other witnesses, would you have any figures regarding adaptation needs across Canada that is beyond the $2 billion currently earmarked for the strategy?
Produced one at this point in time. The evidence that we would share with the members, we find that each dollar spent on adaptation avoids $5 to $10 of losses in the future, and the amount of money being spent is not sufficient. The losses are unacceptable, and that further investment than what is in place right now would be a really wise investment by this government.
Maybe one more point to add. From 2015 to 2024, the federal government invested either directly or by way of tax subsidies $160 billion into mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Over the same period of time, the federal government invested $6.7 billion in adaptation. The ratio of spending in the country, as per the climate file, on mitigation versus adaptation, it's a ratio of 24 to 1. almost everything's going to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and virtually nothing on adaptation. So I don't know what the right ratio is, but it's not the lopsided 24-1, that's for sure.
Okay.
Pouvez-vous nous parler de la différence?
Could you speak to the difference between the impact costs? That is, you're saying it's 2.5 Celsius for global warming overall. That is the current trajectory that we're on. It's approximately 5 degrees for Canada. Is there a major difference? Let's say if we were to comply with the Paris Accord, that rather than 2.5 degrees, or if we were to go beyond that? I could begin. As I mentioned, the trend is that we're increasing by 9.4% per year. My colleague has studied the societal costs of extreme weather events, and he has looked at construction costs, specifically that Canada has to pay out in order to rebuild, and that's 3% of the annual construction costs overall. That is 2 weeks every year will be allocated to rebuilding expenses. So if we're continuing on that trend, and we are following closely on the United States, if we're there, we could find ourselves in a place where costs are increasing considerably. Could you speak about the difference in the different costs depending on the scenarios as 1.5 degrees internationally in Canada or 2.5 degrees Celsius internationally? Is it exponential? What would the costs represent? It is exponential. That is, the more we increase, the greater the risks are. The more there will be expenditures. It will be 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of expenditures for companies, and it would be difficult to give you an exact figure, but the more we go ahead. So do you have a scenario document, some kind of analysis that could illustrate these kinds of differences, even if it's just a general sense?
Here with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for 20 years, trying to answer these science questions. So we found it very hard. They're excellent questions, they're important questions, but they're hard to answer. The part that we answered with more rigor is emissions cause warming. We've quantified that. Emissions cause more precipitation.
Okay,
emissions also cause other storms, and that's just hard to quantify.
Thank you, the witness, for those answers. And we will now move to the Conservatives. Mr. Leslie, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Kovacs. You mentioned the 10% gap that we're looking at there for coverage. So obviously we're looking at some sort of a government-supported insurance-backed system here. How do we avoid creating a system where private insurers keep profits in good years but push losses onto taxpayers in bad years?
And invite Susan to come in as well as an insurer, as opposed to an academic giving an opinion on this. So we're in a situation for flooding where about 10% of Canadians are not presently covered by flood insurance because they have high or extremer risk and are largely viewed as uninsurable because of the very high risk. Until we bring the risk down, there is going to be a long-standing issue where the private industry will say, perhaps we'll say, this is uninsurable. The risk is beyond our capability of offering a price that would be acceptable. If we can bring the risk down, then we are offering flood insurance to people with low risk. I mean, that's not been an issue. The private sector is very active with the 90% of us in areas that are not at high risk. So one of the critical parts is, can we identify as society those specific locations where risk is unacceptable to insurance and to society and do something about it?
So, I come from Manitoba. We have a lot of water-related issues we have in our own property personally there. A lot of this seems to be land use and development, particularly in our case in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of impacts upriver, so to speak, that have a big impact, as well as population growth, development in high-risk zones. And in terms of the costing, obviously the ever-increasing price of upgrading things. So you mentioned some costing with the DFAA program, some changes. Could you help me understand what those changes were and whether those enhancements allow for resiliency to be built back in better, as you kind of alluded to? If you need a bigger culvert, you need to spend more money the next time around. So could you kind of run through what those changes are and how they've been helpful thus far and where you can see them going?
So we are fans that we think the change made on April 1st in DFA was a very positive move by the Government of Canada, and we're looking for the provinces and others to pick it up and really act upon the changes. An example of one of the changes is DFA is offered under 5 streams. Stream number 5 says, once the Government of Canada accepts a provincial cost and reimburses a provincial cost, as it has for many years, as that continues to happen, there is an additional funding made available to the province, in this case 20% funding, that is used for risk reduction. This is new, very generous, where the Government of Canada says, you need $1 billion to put things back, we will give you $1 billion and 20% to put things back, and with risk reduction. So this is a very helpful change. Also, the tone of DFAA, the spirit since 1970 with the program, as the provinces picked up the program in most cases, was, can we put people back? The tone of the new program is, can we put people back with a clear message with reduced risk? The message, the purpose of what the Government of Canada is trying to make Canadians do, in my opinion, is a very helpful, improved tone. We want to put you back after a big loss with reduced risk.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit about the adaptation of the $2.1 billion program. I'm curious your assessment on how it has been prioritized thus far in terms of spending, and if you were the government, how would you prioritize that batch of money or any future batch? Like, where would you put the money towards for the best use for adaptation purposes?
I love volunteering answering, so if I can go first, as Susan and Blair and Sophie, I'm sure, would touch on as well. The fact that all the losses continue to show going up and up, it's not enough. We need more money put in for risk reduction. We know where the risks are the highest. It's very easy. We can identify, here's where the wildfires are, here's where the floods are, and we would target the areas with the highest risk. There's a scientific basis to say more money should go here than there because the risk is higher.
So, I mean, we know the actions to be taken to take a house and or a community and make it less exposed to wildfire. We know exactly what needs to be done to take houses and communities to make them less vulnerable to flooding. We can use berms, diversion channels, holding ponds, cisterns, bioswales, permeable surfacing to direct water to safe locations and keep people and property out of harm's way. What we need to do is mobilize known solutions to known problems, and we need to do it rapidly. And just to be clear, people need to understand that climate change is irreversible, period. Climate change is here to stay. We're not going backwards. All we can do is slow it down. So if we think extreme weather is extreme now, just hold on, because it's going to get a lot worse going forward.
Thank you very much for that. And we now turn to Ms. Medema for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses for coming. I'm really excited for day one of this study. It's a study that I proposed. I've been involved in this issue for many years, since my time working for the city of Halifax on climate change. In 2023, we had a wildfire in Tantallon that destroyed many houses in a suburban area near the kind of wildland urban interface. We had a hurricane and we had a flash flood that took 4 lives just outside of the boundary of HRM. So, thinking back to that Tantallon wildfire, we were scrambling, obviously, because Halifax and Nova Scotia aren't used to kind of this situation. And we were trying to figure out how the insurance sector plays in something like the rebuild after a wildfire, when insurance has typically been like for like in the exact same place. So maybe a question for Ms. Penwarden and others is, is the insurance sector thinking about flexibility in its coverage so that we can build back better and reduce risk on a go-forward basis?
So I can say that most insurance companies now have some sort of Build Back Better allowance within their insurance products. What's interesting is last year, for example, with all of the floods and events that we had, we wrote to all of our individual claimants to urge them to take advantage of the extra funds available, and also, as I mentioned, the municipal incentives to help them build back better. We didn't get a lot of take-up, which is interesting. So back to the education and the need to make it more visible what's available and encourage people to do that. On the subject of that in general, I think obviously we want to work on that. And when it comes to building back in the same location, typically we don't require the same location physically anymore. We will obviously move the customer or the claimant to a location that's more appropriate. That's part of the claims settlement process.
Well, as Susan touched on, most insurance companies in the last few years have brought in something. Many municipalities are doing something. This is not yet coordinated. The federal government through DFA has brought in something, but we're all doing it, and it's not yet together.
Sounds like a story that we've heard before across many issues. Thanks for that. So, Ms. Penwarden, on the other side of it, are there any benefits for your clients if they were to implement any type of resilience measure, flooding, wildfire, et cetera? Would they get like a decrease in their insurance premium? And is that typical of the insurance sector in Canada?
Certainly they would. If they let us know that they've taken specific resilience measures, we will change their premium based on those measures that are shared with us that they've done. So yes, we will do that in terms of premium. We also factor that into our cost models, so which is a more, if you like, a wider way of looking at risk. So we look at it both individual property level and also if there's community level resilience changes that are made, that comes into our pricing as a general possibility. And I know that other insurance companies are looking at the same types of incentives. Each does their own sort of version of it, but there's definitely incentives for individual Canadians to take those actions.
What does the math look like on that? Would there be, a calculated, return on investment for the homeowner? So say the measure cost, I don't know, $5,000 or $10,000. Would the premium ultimately pay that down over a certain number of years? Like, do you have numbers on that?
I don't have specific numbers on that, but if you think about the fact that we're insuring many, many Canadians across many, many different geographies, it would be hard because we share risk as it is. It's a pool of risk, if you like, and everybody helps to contribute to everybody's insurance coverage. So it's a little less than a one-to-one relationship, but there's definitely some reduction in cost for an individual Canadian who takes those actions.
Have comments on that?
One quick point, and so we're talking a lot about insurance and incentives and adjustments in premiums and cap limits and so forth. That's all important, but also don't forget the banks. So we're in the early stages of discussion right now with the banks for homeowners who put the measures in place to mitigate flood or wildfire risk. Could they get a couple of basis points shaved off the cost of their mortgage because there's a lower probability of them having a flooded basement or a house burned down, which if you're holding the mortgage on a property, that's important. So there's multiple financial drivers emerging rapidly.
Thank you very much for that. And we will now move to Mr. Bonin for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Blair, I believed you spoke about the reassurance program. How many years now has the federal government been speaking, studying, looking at the possibility of implementing this kind of program?
Pour les 1.5
For the $1.5 billion for that percentage of people who cannot be insured. I think it's 15% that you mentioned.
Residential housing market, 1.5 million Canadians. So if the question is how long has the federal government been looking at this file? For a long time. And we've got lots of policy on it. The problem isn't policy. We're policy rich and operations poor. That's the problem. We've had in 2016, we had the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which had explicit direction in it in Chapter 4 on how to mobilize adaptation. Nothing happened. From that report. 2018, we had the Adaptation Resiliency Measures Roundtable and Report. That came out in 2018. Within 6 months, that sat on a shelf. Now, in 2023, we had the National Adaptation Strategy, which put out 26 targets to mobilize action on adaptation, 10 of which are to be realized before 2026 closes. And we're virtually going to miss all of those. So the problem is, when we have known solutions to known problems and we cannot get the federal government to act, to mobilize on that direction. That's the problem.
Ça prendrait combien de temps pour mettre en place?
How much time would it take to implement a kind of insurance program for that?
Short period of time, 2 to 5 years or something like that, because we know what needs to be done. And to a large extent, we're doing it. And what we're doing, to some extent, we're saying, by the way, we'd like to get support of the federal government, like come along with us.
Okay. Quand on parle, Mr. Kovacs,
Mr. Kovacs, you've spoken about management. I believe that you're a specialist, you're an expert in crisis management. Many provinces come into play when a disaster occurs. For example, the Army will come in and help. So would it not be better to strengthen the province's intervention abilities and to coordinate these together rather than creating a completely new national or federal intervention structure? It seems to me that the principle of subsidiarity that is closer to people would be more efficient. And what is it that we need on a federal level exactly?
So very much it would be better to have a national system for emergency management. Most countries, almost all countries have done this. Canada right now has not got as much coordination between what the federal government does, what the provincial governments, what municipal. Having that coordination would be a good thing.
Thank you for that. And we will now turn to the Conservatives with Mr. Bexty for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. I appreciate it. This is a very important topic. I have to some of my questions were stolen by other members across the way, so they beat me to the punch, and that's fantastic. I did want to talk or ask some questions related to, I think the comment was proactively incentivizing resiliency. That there are always unintended consequences of other actors, different levels of government doing things, civil works that impact each other, right? How do we develop a bit more coordinated organization, structure, strategy to make sure that we're not, cutting off our nose to spite our face by other actors? And maybe a specific instance, I know where there's been some overland flooding that we had flood maps, and this goes to the next question about flood mapping and the status of that, where a road gets built that hasn't been included in that map, but then exasperates a flooding event because water can't drain like it used to drain, right? And then how does that impact the homeowner?
I can build on, in particular, coordination. It ties back to the earlier question as well. Our research shows if the homeowner spends $1 to protect their home, if the community spends $1 to protect their home, there will be $5 or $10 of avoided losses. The challenge right now is the homeowner does not themselves get the $5 to $10. It is shared by the homeowner, but also by the Government of Canada, by the provincial government, by the municipal government, by the insurance company. And if we have a system where you're waiting entirely for insurance to pay all of the costs, it isn't adding up. It hasn't happened, right? Insurance does give discounts, but it is not enough to get homeowners to work. Until we get that coordination where all of those who are benefiting come together and coordinate what they are doing and jointly say, together we will put one big incentive or we will coordinate the different incentives we do. And how do you do that? Someone needs to lead. And at the moment, the leaders have been municipal governments. They are acting very effectively. And insurance companies. That's not coordinated, but they have independently have seen their own enlightened reasons to do this. And at the moment, the federal government is not there. The provinces are really not there. So it's someone, hopefully the federal government, would bring all the beneficiaries together and say, we will now coordinate what we do or want to do and give back some of the benefits we are getting, because there's a lot of money on the table that's getting lost because we're failing to protect ourselves.
So following from that, how essential is it to complete modern flood mapping and keeping it alive, right? So it is updated in a meaningful time frame. Anyone? Go ahead, Mr. Feltman.
Basically, Canada has to swallow some very tough medicine on flood risk mapping. It's the kind of, people like flood risk maps until they have them. And then all of a sudden they find out this community over here or this community over here is now designated as being in a flood zone. And people, I can tell you, I've been involved in this many times, people go apoplectic when that happens because you've now devalued their property and stigmatized it, you've red tagged it. And almost immediately they start with, how do we even know climate change is real? Like that's, that will be their response. However, by not recognizing that we need floodplain maps to direct where not to build or where to reinforce building to mitigate the flood risk. By not addressing this is what, for the graph I showed at the very beginning with the costs going up, exponentially. That's what you get. There is no way to cheat this system. If you cheat the system, you're going to lose. And that's the way it is.
Okay. Very small part I'd add, if I can, very quickly.
Real quick.
That flood maps are not ideal. They need to improve. We have maps for wildfire, and they're excellent. We have maps for tornadoes. We have maps for hail. We have maps for a lot of the climate risks, and they're outstanding. Flood needs some work.
So, a little bit further on that, I'm not sure if you're familiar. There was some overland flooding in my riding, Bow River, Tabor, Alberta, in 2018, and subsequent to that, not 2018, but the Horsefly Spillway project near Tabor to mitigate this was a municipal and intermunicipal project. It's delayed because of COVID, because of lots of other things, and prices are escalating. So how do we bridge that gap when projects get delayed and inflation? They ran out of project money because the budget ran out. How do we get past that?
Advising the government of Alberta, who have to take the lead with support from the federal government. Before the 2013 flooding, there had been studies about what needed to be done for Calgary, and they weren't done. And so there were losses in 2013. They were avoidable. Anyways, the key is to just get on. Do something.
Just figure it out.
Just
okay.
do something.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will go to Mr. Fanjoy.
Thank you, witnesses. Mr. Kovacs, I'd like you to elaborate. You were saying how flood mapping can be updated, needs to be updated, and you suggested that wildfires are the state of knowing where that risk is stronger, hailstorms and other extreme weather events. I wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate that because I would have thought that floodplains would be more predictable, and I didn't get that impression.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. The most common hazard in our country is flood, so we need to get this one right, and it's not right at the moment. But there was $13 billion worth of damage that Canadians experienced last year, and it wasn't all flooding. Most of it wasn't flooding last year. And so how do we look across all the hazards as part of our research program? We know where the wildfires are. The maps are all agreed to. There's not a debate about the wildfire maps. We know where the hail happens. We know where the very strong winds create tornadoes and hurricanes. So for most of the climate hazards, for earthquakes, moving past climate, the hazard maps are determined. They were determined 20 years ago, and we just nudge it every year. Flood, it keeps changing. We have people move into zones of high risk. We're trying in the 70s to stop that, but we have people move into zones of high risk. The one is where the water goes. It's how fast the water goes, but it's what you put in these different locations. And we need to do better on the flood maps. The maps, even if you get them all up to date, they need to be maintained. That's part of the process as well. And flood map, that's a bigger challenge than most of the other hazards.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Feltmate, you brought up the ratio between measures to mitigate extreme weather events, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and to adapt. And I think the ratio you shared was 26 to 1, mitigation versus adaptation. I think it would be interesting to know what, from a public policy standpoint, what would be a good ratio, or at least a good range for that to be. And has there been any study by the insurance industry or the adaptation community on what that ratio should be?
Yeah, in terms of a study, I'm not sure it was a study, but when you turn to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, for example, was leaning more into the zone of 50-50. And I'm not sure that was based on a rigorous algorithm than more gut feel. But what they were saying, it certainly is not, it's certainly not 24 to 1. And but it's, I think probably very much in that zone of a 50-50 ratio that many people would agree with.
Okay, thank you. I believe it was you, Mr. Feltmate, that presented the graph showing the increased rate of insured losses over the years. My first question was, were those inflation-adjusted numbers? Okay, I thought so.
Well, it's adjusted for inflation and for per capita wealth accumulation. In other words, if you were insuring twice as many homes today as 10 years ago, you'd assume insurance would be twice as high. So that's taken into account. So horizontally, you were looking at a comparison of apples to apples.
Okay. Good. And it was a curve, and it was a curve that was getting steeper. It's hard to imagine a more existential crisis for an insurance industry than unmitigated climate change. How prepared is the insurance industry for that curve to get steeper?
Well, so I'm not speaking for the insurance industry, but overall, there's about 160 property and casualty insurance companies in Canada, or something in that order. I could say some are very well prepared. It tends to be those at the larger end of the equation are much better prepared than others, but there's a lot of variance in the system.
Okay. And how well are the different levels of government, you mentioned municipal government and the insurance industry is working quite well together. Provinces and the federal government, you were leaving those out, I noted. So how big is the gap? How much more? What would you like to see?
From my perspective, I spend a great deal of time with mayors and councillors across this country, and I would say something like 9 out of 10 mayors, when you show them this is what you need to do, the actions you need to take in your community to help your constituents not end up with a flooded basement or their house burned down, 9 out of 10 get it instantly within 5 or 10 minutes, and they want to mobilize action to mitigate the risk. Adaptation in Canada is moving forward at the level of the municipality.
Thank you very much for that testimony to all our witnesses. Thank you very much for all that. That was very enlightening. We will now suspend and give our staff time to get our next round of witnesses in for round 2.
Thank you, sir.